Thank you so much, Sasha. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Health Matters, a virtual lecture series on medicine, illness, and public health, sponsored by the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at New York University. My name is Melissa Miller, and I am Assistant Professor of Russian Studies at Colby College. We would like to thank the Jordan Center for sponsoring the series and Sasha Shpitalnik for her technical expertise in hosting today's event. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Anna Mazanik. She is an environmental and medical historian of Russia and a research fellow at the Max Weber Network, Eastern Europe in Germany. Born in Moscow, she has studied in Russia, Hungary, Germany, and the United States, and holds a PhD in history from Central European University. Today's talk, entitled Russia's Sanitary City, Public Health and Environment in Late Imperial Moscow, presents research from Dr. Mazanik's recently published book, Sanitizing Moscow, Waste, Animals, and Urban Health in Late Imperial Russia, recently published in 2025 by the University of Pittsburgh Press. The book discusses how Moscow, Europe's sixth largest city in 1900, introduced the most extensive program of sanitary reforms among the cities of the Russian Empire. Those reforms created a new sanitary regime, the Russian version of the sanitary city, based on the medicalization of urban politics and the municipalization of public health. How and why did Moscow elites understand and engage with sanitary problems? Why did it happen at that particular moment? Who benefited from sanitizing Moscow and who was excluded? How can one reconcile the sanitary reforms with Moscow's stunning mortality rates? Why was the sanitary city so deadly? Today, Dr. Mazanik will specifically focus on a major paradox of the sanitary project, the problem of children's health in the city, and show that Moscow's public health policy towards children reveals a peculiar combination of consideration and neglect, with innovative and successful efforts to create a healthier childhood and to support socially disadvantaged children on the one hand, and the failure to tackle the most dramatic health problems among younger children on the other. Our format today will be as follows. Dr. Mazanik will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion to questions from the audience for about 30 minutes. If you have a question, please type it in the chat, and I'll read it to Dr. Mazanik for her to respond to. Dr. Mazanik, thank you again so much for being with us today. I'll turn things over to you now. Please begin whenever you are ready.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful introduction and for inviting me here. I'm really very happy to present my work and my book. And thanks everybody for joining this event. So I will start by kind of summarizing the main arguments of the book and giving you the overview of the structure. And then I will zoom in on the last two chapters, which deal with children. Russia's Sanitizing Moscow is an environmental history of public health reforms in late Imperial Moscow between 1870 and 1917. It explores the relationship between Russia's urban modernization and more than human environment in the context of the major social and political changes triggered by the liberal reforms of the 1860s and 1870s and the transnational rise of scientific medicine and sanitary technologies. Among Russian cities, Moscow, the second metropolis of the empire and Europe's largest city, sixth largest city in 1900, introduced the most extensive program of sanitary reforms. Despite their many shortcomings, controversies, and inconsistencies, this was a very ambitious and innovative program with profound social and environmental effects, and this dynamic transformation is obscured by dry references to grim mortality and morbidity statistics that often guide the evaluation of such reforms in more general works on Moscow's urban history, but perhaps some of these works you are familiar with. One goal of my book is to revise the image of the sanitary reforms as logical answers to the objective challenges of urbanization, industrialization, and the deteriorating environment and health. Instead, I show that in Moscow, the reasons for the sudden public concern with pollution and sanitation were not so much biological, but social and political. The interventions in public hygiene were determined not by the incidence of a particularly dangerous disease or the scale of an ecological problem, but by their power to attract attention and to fuel relevant political debates over modernization, social progress, and Europeanness. This is not to downplay the objective challenges that the Moscow government was facing. The critical, in fact, life and death urban problems in late imperial Moscow were very real, and so was the impressive program of sanitary reforms implemented by the municipality. However, as the book reveals, the program failed to address some of the most crucial and deadliest aspects of urban life, such as the infant and child mortality, and it's impossible to understand this mismatch without considering the cultural factors and politics behind it. Another goal is to place Moscow sanitary reforms into a broader transnational context of modern public health and urban development. In Russian studies, late imperial municipal public health is often viewed as a derivative and inferior version of the innovative system of community medicine pioneered by the rural zemstvos, which are rural self-government institutions, with their free healthcare and the emphasis on preventive work. Yet, many of the challenges that Moscow faced in the last decades of the 19th century were unknown to the zemstvo, but were very similar to those tackled in other rapidly growing cities across the globe. I argue that the competition and exchange with other cities was essential for shaping the politics of public health and sanitation that were envisioned as an instrument in overcoming Moscow's perceived backwardness. Those overlooked and unexplored transnational connections are crucial for understanding the trajectory of Moscow's sanitary policies that by the turn of the 20th century significantly diverged from the zemstvo model towards a new approach based on technological solutions to sanitary problems. Expanding the focus beyond the lens of Russian community medicine allows us to see whether and in which ways the sanitary movement in Russia was similar to such movements in the West. There has been considerable debate on the influence that the changing scientific epistemology, bacteriological discoveries, and the appearance of a laboratory medicine had on the practice of public health in the late 19th century. In the histories of Russian public health, however, bacteriology has been given a rather small part. Although scholars have noted the early reception of bacteriology by some Russian scientists, the focus on the zemstvo community medicine in the countryside led to downplaying the influence that bacteriology had on the public health work, at least before the first decades of the 20th century. By shifting the attention to the urban context, the book offers a different and more nuanced perspective on the relations between bacteriology and sanitation and the role that the rise of the germ theory of disease and laboratory medicine played in the local practice of public health in Russia. Last but definitely not least, I want to emphasize that public health and urban sanitary reforms were not just responses to environmental changes connected to urbanization and industrializations, but were themselves powerful forces in shaping the environment and human relations within a non-human world, and that their impact went beyond the human and influenced other living beings. As I show in this book, sanitary reforms transformed not only urban society, but also urban and rural environments, and led to the establishment of the new sanitary regime, the sanitary city, characterized by the medicalization, municipalization, and technologization. Medicalization meant that urban problems were increasingly described and explained with the language of medical science, while a large part of city politics was now centered on medical agendas. Physicians, veterinarians, and medical scientists started to play a significant role in Moscow's urban policy as employees of a municipality and members of numerous committees that advised the municipal government, developed the program of reforms, and put them into practice. Medicalization was a complex, multi-directional process that covered not only individual human behavior and conditions, but increasingly the material environment and collective social processes such as food supply, production and sale, the disposal and treatment of wastes, the organization of education, the construction of schools and residential buildings that now had to conform with the norms developed by medical experts. This medicalization was not limited to humans, but had an important multi-species dimension. With the rise of veterinary medicine and the germ theory and the new understanding of the interconnectedness of human and animal health, livestock animals were incorporated into the sanitary project in Moscow and in Russia more broadly. New medical agendas, including advances in bacteriology, changed how animals were moved, kept, and killed, and their living and dead bodies had to be inspected, described, explained, and treated by human medical professionals. The processes of subordinating human and animal lives to medical control were linked biologically and politically and were inseparable from the development of elected local government systems in Russia in the form of zemstvos and municipalities, and their quest for greater authority in the autocratic empire. Municipalization meant that in late Imperial Moscow, the municipality emerged as the main provider of health care and sanitary services. In 1870, the city owned only one hospital. On the eve of the First World War, it had 21 municipal hospitals of different specializations, 29 outpatient clinics, 10 maternity homes, a sanitary inspection, a trade sanitary inspection, a school sanitary inspection, a veterinary inspection, a sanitary station for the laboratory research, a disinfection brigade, a disinfection chamber and laundry, an advanced water supply and sewage system with a waste treatment plant and a public abattoir. What set Moscow's sanitary project apart from the health reforms underway in the zemstvos and brought it closer to the metropolises in other countries was its high degree of medical specialization, active international collaboration, and technology-enabled solutions to public health. The core of zemstvo medicine were generalists whose work comprised not only the treatment of all possible diseases and conditions in the residents of their districts, but also prophylaxis and hygiene education. This multitasking and the broad definition of medical work was simultaneously a result of a lack of resources and an ideological pillar of zemstvo medicine. In Moscow, however, the urban version of общественная медицина, the municipal public health, was based on the increasing medical specialization that affected the organization of hospitals and outpatient clinics and their sanitary work. Medicine became intrinsically linked with science and technology, and so did urban hygiene and sanitation. Sanitary technologies that allowed to control the safety of water and food, to detect dangerous parasites and pollution, to wash and to disinfect, to bring large volumes of clean water, and to remove and treat wastes produced by households and industries became essential to that version of public health. Yet, why did those dramatic transformations of a new sanitary city have so little impact on Moscow's mortality statistics? Moscow was famously described as Europe's deadliest metropolis. One way to think about it is in terms of equity and access to public health and sanitary services. Planning and building public health infrastructure, especially with limited funds and cumbersome bureaucratic control that were typical of Russian urban government, took time. In the situation of a dramatic and unprecedented population growth that Moscow experienced in the post-reform decades, combined with often transient character of migration and the lack of generational continuity, the sanitary city remained highly fragmented and incomplete. Despite the strong rhetoric of serving the entire urban community behind the sanitary reforms, public services, including hospitals and outpatient clinics, school and nurseries, sewers and water pipes, were permanently scarce and tended to concentrate in the inner districts, creating sharp inequalities in use and access. The outskirts of the city couldn't partake in the new sanitary regime, although by the early 20th century, it was in those underserved districts that the population growth and epidemic burden was the highest. Crucially, however, as I tried to show in the book, the problem was not only the lack of time and resources to complete the sanitary city. I argue that it is important to see the task of making the city more sanitary as distinct from the task of making it less deadly. Although Moscow reformers invested a huge effort in the former, they only occasionally dealt with the latter. The ranking of the reforms on the municipal agenda didn't follow the logic of what problem is the major killer. Instead, prioritizing was influenced by the political aspirations for Europeanness and a greater authority and autonomy for the municipality, the ideologies of community medicine, international influences on what a sanitary city should look like and what aspects of urban life should be problematized and changed, personal goals and interests of experts and their ability to convince political leaders. This is why animal health, safe slaughter, and the prevention of zoonotic infections, which had been barely noticeable in the Moscow mortality statistics, received much more attention in municipal public health than gastroenteric diseases of children that killed many thousands every year. This is why the health of school children was guarded by the school sanitary inspection, specialized school outpatient clinics, and summer colonies, while simultaneously tremendous loss of life among infants and preschool children in Moscow had barely been addressed until the very last years of the empire. So now I will move to the structure of the book. It consists of 4 parts, and the first part discusses why Moscow elites suddenly became interested in the environment and public health and provides the historical setting for the case studies in the remaining parts of the book. Chapter 1 explores how disease, pollution, and the environment suddenly became a matter of public concern in the 1870s and 1880s, and reveals that this new attention to the environment was deeply political. While Chapter 2 offers a chronological overview of the Moscow Sanitary project and highlights its evolution from the Zemstvo model to a model based on specialized medical care and complex technological infrastructure. By the 1880s, dirt pollution and disease became a subject of public debate, and the reformed Moscow municipality acknowledged its responsibility to tackle these problems, but the realization of that goal proceeded slowly until the mayorship of Nikolai Alexeyev, who was Moscow's mayor from 1885 until 1893, and it was in this period that the sanitary project saw major breakthroughs. This was when the key initiatives in public health and sanitary services were planned, and the path of Moscow development for the following decades was decided. From the mid-1890s, after the sudden death of Alexeyev and an important legal and personnel changes in the increasingly conservative political climate, the sanitary project lost some of its driving energy. But it was exactly in this later period that many of the initiatives conceived under Alexeyev were finally implemented and completed. The second part of the book studies the problems of waste and water pollution and focuses on the Moscow sewage system built from 1887 until 1898, which was the largest and the most expensive infrastructural reform undertaken by the Moscow government. In Chapter 3, I discuss the competing projects of the Moscow sewage system in the context of transnational interurban exchange and the eventual choice of a separate system modeled on George Warren's design for Memphis, Tennessee. I show how striving for European metropolitan modernity, together with the rise of a germ theory, paradoxically led Moscow to adopt a design from a much smaller American city that was created by a supporter of a miasmatic theory of disease. In Chapter 4, I explore what happened to waste in the Moscow sewage system, whose waste went in, where it ended up, and what it meant for the environments of Moscow suburbs and the local peasant communities whose lands were expropriated to create space for the filtration fields on which the Moscow sewage would be deposited and treated. Chapter 5 investigates how the commissioning of the Moscow sewage system transformed the public debate, legal treatment, and policy toward the industrial pollution of waterways in the wider industrial region of Central Russia. Wait, sorry, something went. The third part of the book examines the medicalization and industrialization of animal slaughter through the case of the Moscow abattoir, built from 1886 until 1888, the project in which Moscow reformers took particular pride. Chapter 6 studies the origins of the livestock slaughtered in Moscow. It tells the unknown history of Russian cowboys who were driving cattle to Moscow markets from the steppe regions north of the Black Sea and the Caspian, and even from Central Asia, and discusses the part that medical consideration and policies played in shaping this process. Chapter 7 analyzes slaughterhouse reform in Moscow, the motivations behind it, the built environment of the abattoir, as well as the medicalization of animal slaughter and the influence it had on disease control in Moscow and the distant stock raising regions. Drawing on the rich correspondence between the abattoir's management and the Russian Society for the Protection of Animals, Chapter 8 unravels the approaches to animal rights and welfare in Tsarist Russia and shows that the debates about the well-being of animals and humans were tightly linked. And here we come to the final fourth part of my book, which investigates what I consider to be a major paradox of the Moscow Sanitary project, the problem of children's health in the city, through the lens of two contrasting cases. Chapter 9 examines the issue of a very high infant mortality rate in Moscow, which played a dominant role in the city's general mortality statistics and therefore in the overall evaluation of the Moscow Sanitary project. It discusses the social and environmental factors that contributed to this extreme mortality and the measures the municipal government did and did not introduce to control it. Finally, Chapter 10 looks at the emergence of school hygiene and school sanitary inspection in Moscow in 1889. At the same time, primary education was dramatically expanding in the city. By analyzing the daily work of school sanitary doctors in Moscow, I explore how medical professionals shaped the school environment and through it, the experience of schooling and urban childhood more broadly. So I will now go a little bit deeper into these last chapters. I must say, I relatively rarely present this specific part of my books. I'm particularly excited because the overall topic was connected more to health and to the environment. So I decided to focus on this specific part. And it was the very last addition to the book. So it was the last part I wrote. It was not present in my doctoral dissertation on which it was based. So in the last third of the 19th century, Russia, similar to many other societies worldwide, witnessed an explosion of interest in children. Children became an object of scientific research, evaluation, and categorization, and a highly politicized matter of national interest. An important focus of this increasingly vocal child welfare movement was extremely high child and especially infant mortality in Russia. So those of you who are dealing with the 19th century would be familiar with these statistics. Not only were infant mortality rates much higher than in Western European countries with which Russia was competing, but they are also higher than in Central and Southeastern Europe and within the empire itself, most dramatic among the Orthodox population of Central Russia. Although contemporaries focused primarily on extreme mortality in the countryside, about which Zemstvo physicians left abundant sources, death rates among urban children were enormous, and in some age groups higher than in the village. Among the metropolises of the Russian Empire and among major European cities, Moscow had the highest child mortality, a poor recommendation for the city that was implementing ambitious sanitary reforms. So this problem again reveals an important paradox of the Moscow Sanitary project. Throughout the late imperial decades, it was exactly the deaths of infants and small children that were driving the city's overall high mortality rates. Both in the 1880s and in the 1910s, more than half of all annual recorded fatalities in the cities were made up by the deaths of children under the age of 5. Just think about it for a second. It's a really huge number. Although urban reformers were conscious of Moscow's gruesome mortality statistics, it is surprising how little attention was paid to its major cause. The roots of the excessive deaths in early childhood Inadequate nutrition, the lack of care, poor hygiene, overcrowding, child abandonment, and poverty were largely understood. The possible solutions, such as nursery, hygiene education, improved housing, better medical care, and assistance to poor mothers, were identified. The Moscow municipality had no power over employment relations. It could not increase salaries, introduce obligatory maternity leave, or regulate the conditions of working parents. But the medical and sanitary provisions, housing regulation, and childcare facilities were within its responsibility, within its power. Yet Moscow had no special program dedicated to infant or children health and care, similar to the sanitary, veterinary, food, or school inspection, or the inspection of prostitutes. So it's not that the statistic would appear as surprising to you, but what is surprising, and I was really shocked by this, that when you view this absence of involvement in the context of major reforms, sanitary reforms going in other spheres. The fact that this sphere was left out of the municipal public health and sanitary programs is remarkable, considering that childbirth, for example, underwent strong medicalization. Since the 1880s, the city had invested substantial resources into childbirth care and the free birthing institutions. The first 4 so-called birthing shelters were established already in 1880, and in the following years, their number grew to 12. In the 1890s, municipal childbirth assistance then shifted towards birthing houses, bigger hospital-like institutions, which were run not by midwives, but by obstetricians with a medical degree, usually male, while midwives were female. In the 15 years between 1895 and 1910, the number of beds in municipal childbirth clinics saw a 6-fold increase. The proportion of childbirths that took place in those institutions grew from 13% in 1890 to 34% in 1900 and 60% in 1910, showing that medicalized labor was gradually becoming a norm in Moscow. However, after children left those birthing homes and before they entered school, they completely fell out of a system of sanitary and public health control unless their parents explicitly sought medical assistance at one of the city hospitals or outpatient clinics. Crucially, hospitals, even children's hospitals, did not seem to play any role in addressing the major causes of child deaths in Moscow, which were diarrheal and respiratory diseases, and in fact, hardly encountered them at all. For example, Moscow's St. Vladimir's Children's Hospital, which was praised as a model of a modern science-based clinic for children and served as a practical school for professionalizing field of pediatrics. Yet if you look at the hospital records, you see how rarely you encounter the major causes of death among children at that time. So for example, in 1900, in the long list of diagnoses that led to hospitalization with infectious and chronic diseases, tumors and injuries, only several dozen cases were attributed to diarrheal or respiratory diseases, the conditions that killed thousands of Moscow children that same year. Even though the medical arsenal against those conditions was indeed very limited before the advent of antibiotics and oral rehydration therapy, it is still remarkable that the vast majority of such deaths happened outside of hospitals. Moscow's growing and diversifying healthcare system couldn't address the city's exceptional child mortality, as most parents did not seek or didn't receive medical care. According to some accounts, children below the age of 2 were even sometimes denied admission to hospitals because of their very low survival chances. Another angle from which the municipality could address the problem of child mortality was the provision of public infant and childcare facilities. Such measures were within the responsibility of Russian municipal governments. They were widely advocated by community physicians and operated in other European metropolises. Moscow did have a system of public nurseries that were very popular with the poor urban families. Those nurseries, however, were not seen as a part of a sanitary project, nor in fact of public education, but instead as an aspect of charity, and were organized by the municipal guardianships of the poor, which meant that they remained a neighborhood affair based on volunteer work and financed through private donations. Most importantly, the program of nurseries remained small in scale and couldn't meet the demand of Muscovites for public childcare. Not only did the program remain much smaller than municipal involvement in schooling or public health, but the expansion of the program slowed down in the early 20th century despite the rapid urban growth. Increasingly populated city outskirts and suburbs remained particularly disadvantaged. Moscow had 44 municipal nurseries with 1,400 children in 1903 and 50 nurseries with 1,700 children in 1912, while the city population grew by 400,000 over the same period. That year, Moscow had more than 200,000 children of preschool age, and more than 6,000 Moscow infants were abandoned by their parents and given away to the foundling home, which is the imperial orphanage. So there were only 1,700 nursery places, and 6,000 infants were abandoned that same year. It's often more difficult to say why political actors did not address a specific problem than why they did. The implemented sanitary reforms that I discuss in other chapters of the book left abundant documentation that allows us to reconstruct the motivations behind them, the explanations provided, the goals set, even if not achieved, and the paths not taken. For reforms that didn't take place and were not even planned, no such material exists. A possible explanation of why the government of late Imperial Moscow had no program to tackle child mortality can be that it was not seen as a sphere demanding targeted municipal attention in the Alexeyevan period, a crucial time for the Moscow sanitary project when its key directions and formats were determined. At the turn of the 1890s, the number of children born in Moscow was relatively small, and the large proportion of infant deaths in the city occurred in the foundling home, the imperial orphanage, which was not controlled by the municipality, and furthermore was itself being reformed at that time. In that situation, it was possible to hope that infant mortality would diminish because of the improved arrangements at the foundling home and the broader public health measures aimed at the entire urban community, such as the sanitary inspection, the sewage system, and the water pipe, better access to medical services, and the poor relief that were all being established or expanded under Alexeyev. In fact, it is likely that some of these interventions were indeed having an effect as infant mortality was gradually declining until the early 1900s, and this positive trend made the overall problem appear less urgent. However, these measures turned out to be insufficient in the long run, especially as the city continued to grow demographically and expand spatially. In the early 20th century, the rates of infant mortality stopped declining, while the absolute number of children dying and their proportion in the total fatalities in Moscow actually increased. Combined with the heightened public attention to child mortality in Russia in the early 20th century, the professionalization of pediatrics and obstetrics, this made the problem more acute and visible. The appearance in 1902 of the Municipal Committee of Obstetricians, which included all obstetricians and female directors of maternity shelters, facilitated the lobbying of specific measures on infant care within the municipal structures. The resulting policy changes, such as the expansion of maternal, neonatal, and pediatric care, the opening of so-called consultations for mothers, and milk kitchens, which provided free pasteurized milk, appeared only in the last decade of the empire, and they remain too small in scale, and they are unevenly distributed across the city space for their results to be really felt in the remaining years until the Bolshevik Revolution. There was, however, a very specific and numerous group of urban children whose health received considerable municipal attention, the pupils of municipal schools. This attention appears in sharp contrast to the laissez-faire policy towards the health of infants and small children, the groups that had much higher mortality rates. There was a visible effort to offer school children better medical care and a healthier environment, and this effort has until now been somewhat overlooked by historians, and this is what I focus on in the last chapter of my book entitled Healthy Schools in a Deadly City. The post-reform, it's useful to have the previous slide. The post-reform decades recorded an unprecedented expansion of primary schools, both in Moscow and in Russia as a whole. In the 1870s, physicians and hygienists joined pedagogues and educators in the debates on schooling and its needs. Educational reformers recognized that school could shape not only the pupils' minds, knowledge, and morality, but also their bodies and physical development, and that the two spheres were in fact tightly interconnected and inseparable. This meant that although the content and style of teaching remained the primary concern, there were now new variables that could determine the results of schooling: the material environments of schools, the temporal and spatial organization of the educational process, and its ability to accommodate, adjust to, harm, or change pupils' bodies. There are several aspects that make the study of Moscow schools particularly interesting. First, Moscow was very early, both in Russia and internationally, to institutionalize medical control in municipal schools through the introduction of a school sanitary inspection in 1889 and the establishment of school outpatient clinics. Furthermore, both Moscow municipality and municipal school physicians showed remarkable commitment to a more inclusive gender policy and promoted school education for girls and the right to medical practice for women. Finally, Moscow, unlike many smaller towns and zemstvos, had enough financial, social, and infrastructural resources to actually implement at least some of the expert recommendations and to translate scientific ideas into practice. In his study of rural schools, historian Ben Eklov has repeatedly emphasized the distinct schooling culture that emerged in post-reform Russia. This culture, he argued, focused on non-coercive motivation, fostering self-esteem and initiative, and radically differed both from the overall Russian realities and from the oppressive classroom that, according to some interpretations, persisted elsewhere in Europe. In his words, the existence of such a child-centered classroom in a coercive, hierarchical, authoritarian society is a major paradox. One important question for me is whether and how school sanitary physicians in Moscow contributed to the construction of this so-called child-centered classroom, what this approach meant for the material environment of schools and the way children used it. In this chapter of my book, I analyze the daily work of school sanitary physicians and their key fields of intervention. One major preoccupation of Moscow physicians was the organization of school space. Importantly, most of the municipal schools in Moscow were located in rented premises, which were not meant for educational purposes. Opening a municipal school did not imply constructing a specific school building, the scheme that we are used to today. In fact, the link between school as an educational institution and school as a special type of physical space was only emerging. In late Imperial Moscow, schools usually occupied only a part of the building, sharing it with private apartments. When a proper school building existed, it often housed several legally and educationally independent schools. So for instance, in the upper image, you see this building kind of is symmetrical, and on one side there was a school for boys and the other side school for girls. But sometimes there are more than two schools located within the same school building. Finding the school premises was a big problem, and potential premises and who decided whether those could be converted into schools. The fact that school premises were all of different quality and could be found, and a separate evaluation and decision had to be taken in each case. Physicians mobilized their knowledge and resourcefulness to make the available school space more comfortable for a child's body and accommodating of its needs. They determined the type of school furniture and its arrangement. They proposed adjustments to ventilation and heating systems, requested the construction of additional ovens or reorganization of toilets. Many of these small adjustments and recommendations were, in fact, implemented. And that activity, however mundane it might seem, affected the comfort of children and schools and their lived experience of schooling. Furthermore, constant reports of school physicians on the inadequacy of the rented premises motivated the municipality to construct its own proper school buildings. The construction norms for such buildings were developed by architects together with school doctors and reflected many of their previous concerns and recommendations, and some of these recommendations shape Russia's school buildings until today. For example, warm meals for pupils promoted by physicians required cooking and eating facilities, so according to the new norms, all school projects had to include kitchens and canteens. The construction rules also forbade locating any classrooms on the semi-basement floor and established the proper size of rooms and windows. They required separate ventilation and water-based heating systems with a possibility to adjust temperature individually in each room, and stipulated that each building had a room for medical examination. Toilets needed to be heated, naturally lit, and equipped with a separate ventilation system, and a sufficient number of water closets and sinks with running water, usually one per 25 students, so the convenience far above the level that most pupils had at home, where either the kind of toilet in the courtyard or a shared toilet for the entire house was a norm. Moreover, physicians repeatedly emphasized the importance of games and outdoor activities for schooling. Therefore, every school project was required to have recreational rooms and outdoor playground. Apart from trying to create what they saw as a hygienic and comfortable environment for children's bodies at school, physicians also interacted with them in a more direct way. They measured and weighed children twice a year, organized smallpox vaccination, and conducted regular medical examinations. Crucially, fighting infectious disease never became the dominant function of school physicians in Moscow. Despite the growing acceptance of bacteriology, the public health work at schools, similarly to Russian community medicine in general, never underwent a reductionist turn and was not narrowed down to only interrupting the chain of transmission and fighting germs. In fact, among the questions that led to the strongest mobilization of school physicians, better nutrition, adequate school buildings and furniture, abolition of corporal punishment, sufficient rest, physical exercise, and outdoor games, none was directly linked to infectious disease, but all were centered on environmental and lifestyle changes. One important aspect of the activity of sanitary physicians was selecting so-called weaker pupils for the municipal summer colonies. The idea behind this initiative was to allow the weakest and poorest children to spend several months in the countryside in a healthy environment than they could find in Moscow. Summer colonies appeared in 1890 when there were 3 colonies for 90 children. But by 1912, there were already more than 60 such colonies for 3,000 children altogether, so a very significant expansion. The majority of children came from very poor families. About 40% of them were orphans, and about half of all children had never left Moscow before. One common problem in the colonies, which offers a revealing detail to the material status of the Moscow poor, was that most children went on vacation without shoes, and colonies often had to provide footwear on the spot. Importantly, these summer colonies were not just a recreational project for children, but they were seen as an integral part of the school hygiene movement. In line with the school hygiene recommendations, colonies emphasized the importance of games and outdoor physical activity, but also freedom and creativity, and children spent their time playing. Cricket seemed to be a particularly loved game. Bathing, fishing, gardening, walking in the woods, picnicking, handcrafting, drawing, or organizing amateur theaters and choirs. All those activities were, of course, quite normal for the dacha life of the Russian middle classes, but they were something that the poor children rarely encountered. And in the colonies, they received a new medical edge. They were not just recreational, but they were healthy and good for child development. In colonies, as in schools, nutrition and undernutrition received particular attention with a similar emphasis on animal proteins. The board was simple but abundant. Milk and bread for breakfast, meat soup and some cereal, potato, vegetable dish for lunch, tea and bread in the afternoon, usually outdoors, and cottage cheese or porridge and milk for dinner. Importantly, there was no restriction in the size and number of portions. So unlike Oliver Twist, children were allowed to ask for the second portion and in fact encouraged to eat as much as they wanted, most likely a rare opportunity for many of them. In addition, some colonies had their own vegetable gardens, and colonists also regularly went to pick wild berries, usually strawberries and raspberries, and mushrooms abundant in forests of European Russia. Although this was a relatively diverse diet, the colony organizers were concerned mostly about the consumption of meat and milk, which was monitored, calculated, and served as a measurement of the health and nutrition. According to the 1892 report, an average child consumed about 200 grams of meat and between 600 and 1,200 milliliters of milk every day. So it's actually more than a liter of milk. It's quite a significant amount. And it's also a dramatic contrast to the diet of working classes in central Russia that was very poor in animal protein. As the colonies could accommodate only a small number of children, weakness became the main selection criteria, and school sanitary physicians emerged as the judges to identify the weakest children most in need of summer vacation in the countryside. They indicated which children should be sent to the colonies, examined and measured them before and after their stay, and visited colonies to control their health. Going to summer colonies was voluntary, and parents were not always enthusiastic about sending their children away for 2 months, although it was free, because many needed their help in the household or at work. Therefore, medically defined weakness of children was used as an important argument in the negotiations with their parents about the children's rights or needs. Physicians maintained that at least 15% of all pupils in Moscow were in direct need of such summer vacation for health reasons, and that existing colonies could only host a fraction of those. This argument served as a powerful justification for the expansion of the project, giving more and more children the opportunity to spend summer in the countryside away from the city. The urban policy towards children and the sanitary project in late Imperial Moscow reveal a peculiar combination of consideration and neglect, of medicalization and significant effort to create a healthier childhood, and of a failure to tackle the most dramatic health problems among children below the school age. The question of children's health appeared on the municipal agenda already during the first peak of sanitary reforms in Alexeyev and Moscow, and this resulted in the early institutionalization of medical control in the city schools. Contrary to observation of some scholars about the low authority of school doctors, their poor remuneration, their weak influence over governmental decisions, and sporadic character of their activities, the case of a school medical inspection in Moscow presents a rather different picture. Moscow school doctors performed systematic, diverse, and well-paid work already since the late 1880s. They were full-time municipal employees and inherent part of a growing municipal organization. Some of them were also women, and women and men received the same salary. The authority of school doctors was strong enough to not only transform the school environment and experience of schooling on the micro level, that is in each particular school, but to also affect policy on the level of the city and to prompt changes codified in local norms and regulation. Importantly, the institutionalization of school medical control in Moscow was motivated primarily by sanitary and socio-environmental concerns and had already gained significant experience and authority by the time psychiatry started influencing practical medical activity at schools. Although Moscow school doctors were, of course, striving for more influence and authority, their declared professional goal was to limit the negative impact of schooling on pupils' health, to construct a comfortable, healthy, and safe environment for poor children, and to compensate for the real and assumed hardships that they experienced outside of school. The medical discourse and expertise were mobilized not to achieve greater discipline, but instead to promote the ideals of non-coercive classroom, or rather to make sure that this type of classroom was beneficial not only for children's minds, but also for their bodies. Similar to their colleagues abroad, Moscow physicians were interested in explaining and categorizing child development, in separating the normal from the abnormal and the weak. But it was the physical rather than mental or moral development that remained their primary concern. Although the introduction of a sanitary control in schools subjected children to sometimes rather unpleasant medical manipulations, such as regular examinations or smallpox vaccinations, this has to be viewed in the context of the overall voluntary school system, oppressive and sometimes exploitative treatment of children and their families, and objective health risks that they were facing in Europe's deadliest metropolis. In fact, within the limits of their domain, physicians went perhaps even further than reform-minded pedagogues and advocated freedom, play, rest, and comfort, which in their view could not be sacrificed even for the purposes of education. Indeed, school doctors used medical knowledge to articulate difference, that is, to define weak children. But this difference was used not to segregate or stigmatize, but on the contrary, to support the socially disadvantaged children. Both the theoretical writing of school hygienists and the practical work of school sanitary physicians enabled looking at education from the perspective of health and environment. They linked the environment of schools with health of pupils and their ability to learn, and implied that the municipal government was responsible for the health of those to whom it was providing education. The latter could perhaps explain why school children received so much more medical attention compared to other, even more underserved groups of Moscow child population. School pupils were already a part of a system of municipal public services, and within it of a particularly successful and symbolically important project, education. As such, they were an identifiable, relatively homogeneous, and spatially concentrated collective that was easy to target and where one could reach out to the large number of people with limited resources. In Moscow, the school emerged as a place to monitor, promote, and protect the health of urban children, and a part of the municipal public health system where children could be examined, diagnosed, given medical advice, measured, weighed, or vaccinated. Even though no treatment was usually performed at school, except for the first aid, it was linked to other municipal medical sanitary services, such as school outpatient clinics and sanitary inspection. The leading part in protecting the health of children was given to publicly employed medical professionals, while parents were assigned only a supporting role. However, the voluntary character of schooling and the short course of study meant that the role of physicians in influencing children's health remained limited and temporary. The last point I want to make is that Soviet childhood policy borrowed and built upon many of the initiatives of that imperial community medicine introduced and advocated, and medical inspection and centralized vaccination at schools, free territorial outpatient clinics, and summer camps for children are all familiar to researchers of the Soviet period, but it's important to acknowledge that they first appeared in the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible talk, and I'm sure people will have questions. So what we'd like to do is open up the floor to questions. In order to ask a question, please put it in the chat, and then I will read it out loud to our speaker just so that things are streamlined. So we do have a couple of questions already from the chat. So we've got some things to kick off. And the one question that we have here actually is really quite connected to the last point that you made, Anna, which I think is really a nice segue. And we have a question from Raymond Arendt. And the question is, how did Moscow's efforts compare to those of other big cities in the Russian Empire, such as St. Petersburg or Kiev?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Um, so my understanding and my argument is, and I get it from the sources, that Moscow was viewed as the most successful sanitary city, that the kind of the scope of reforms that it introduced was really kind of the largest in the Russian Empire. And this is the feeling I get from the sources written by Russian physicians. This is also the impression I get from, for example, from the American delegation that visited, American Red Cross delegation that visited Russia during the revolutionary years. So that is, to give you some specific examples. For instance, one of the core studies in my book is the sewerage system and the development of the sewerage system with filtration fields, so with waste treatment plant, was really something quite special because St. Petersburg did not have such a sewerage system, and the sewerage system in St. Petersburg only developed in the Soviet times. So this was really the biggest and the most advanced system in the imperial core. It's not, there were also some smaller projects elsewhere, and there was some projects were earlier. For example, Warsaw had a sewage system developed earlier. But in the kind of Russia proper, Moscow had the biggest and the earliest big sewage system. Then the other cases that I studied, like the slaughterhouse, again, there was a public abattoir developed in St. Petersburg. It appeared 3 years earlier than in Moscow, but because of the position of Moscow, like geographically, it was a much more important meat market because St. Petersburg is kind of, geographically actually on the periphery of the Russian Empire. So Moscow was a major meat market. So it, again, was the bigger slaughterhouse. So with school sanitary inspection, to my knowledge, it was the first in the Russian Empire. But at the same time, the mortality was also the worst. And it was even worse than in St. Petersburg. And infant mortality was worse, which I connect to this very specific social relations, which were typical of Russia, of the Russian Empire as a whole, but they just manifested in a more extreme way in Moscow, which kind of with single motherhood and particularly difficult housing situation, which all contributed to this kind of lack of care and overcrowding in Moscow. And at the same time, there was the foundling home, this orphanage, which was much bigger than in any other city of the Russian Empire, and also according to some calculations, even bigger than anywhere else in Europe. So I don't like, it's not in the focus of my study, but it also, of course, the presence of such a large institution for orphans affected the urban mortality statistics.
Thank you. We have another question from Ariana Benabu, which is about the category of vermin. In your research, did you come across sources that talked about pests such as lice or cockroaches, or did this sort of insect and pest control not play as big a role in sanitization as it did as maybe bacteria or germ concerns did?
Very interesting question. Thank you so much. I must say that, I'm very interested in things related to insects, and my current research project is on arthropods, on ticks and mosquitoes. So I kind of really welcome comments in that direction. And I must say that in the 19th century sources on Moscow, this does not seem to be a major concern. So it, specifically, like even so, lice is important, but overall, I feel that kind of typhus becomes much more important in the 20th century. You know, there is a major epidemic during the Civil War. So in the period that I studied typhus, which where lice is an important vector, somehow it is hidden among other diseases. It exists, but I can't say that it's like a major concern that there it perhaps appears only in the disinfection and laundry services. So that this is one of the reasons why you have to have this municipal laundry services, and why there are also in municipal lodging houses there are special facilities also to wash and disinfect the clothes. So, but it's not very high on the agenda. Interestingly, the zoonotic infections and so animal disease seems to attract much more attention, much more discussion. And this is one of the things that I was myself puzzled with. So like anthrax and trichinosis, well, cattle plague, it's not a zoonotic infection, it's disease of animals, but it's very deadly for cattle, and therefore it kind of causes enormous economic losses. This kind of things, but strangely, cockroaches, flies, insects are not very important. Even mice or rats are not particularly important.
Thank you. We have a question from Jane Burbank. She would like you to comment on the intersection of health actions with the regulation of child labor. Can you say more about the age and other requirements for school education, and if there were children who were not visible to experts who worked on health in schools, maybe because they didn't go to these kinds of municipal schools?
Yes, thank you so much. And Jane, I love your work, and I'm very glad that you you were able to join the seminar. So it's a very important question because schooling was not obligatory. And so it's always voluntary, and there is a discussion of how to make it obligatory. And that's kind of in the early 20th century becomes an important goal of a municipality. But throughout most of the period that I study in my book, it's a voluntary process, and obviously it's up to parents whether to send children to schools or not. And therefore, there is no specific age. And in fact, age is very different. So most children started school around the age of 8. So when I speak about preschool children, that's a rather long period. And even if we speak about nurseries, so the original Russian term was yasli. And today in Russia, the word yasli is used for institutions which house children from birth until the age of 3, probably. And back then, Yasli housed children from birth until the age of 12. So, which suggests that there were children who were, 11 years old, who were still in Yasli and were not attending school. So they used this municipal Yasli. And there was also usually there were free classes, and only towards the end of the imperial period, this kind of elementary school was expanded to 4 classes. But there were much more children in the first grade than in the second and the third. So the classes became much smaller because parents were not always very eager for their children to study because they wanted their children in their household, or perhaps didn't motivate children to stay on. So many children dropped out even after the first and second year. And so obviously there were huge groups of children which were excluded from this project because when the school is voluntary, then not particularly marginalized children do not come there. And one other important aspect is children with special needs. As the project was gradually expanding, there was kind of this conversation and this push towards mandatory schooling. These children now started entering kind of the discussion, right? Because if every child has to go to school, then some children that are perhaps different from our children would also be there. And then that led to the creation of classes for what they consider, like what my actors considered retarded children. But this appeared only at the very, very last years of the imperial periods. And there, at least in the materials I've read, there was also this kind of strong emphasis on child-centered classroom. However, it functioned in reality. Of course, it's difficult to judge. Like I know what was in the curricula, like some clay modeling and walking and drawing. But it is, of course, difficult to evaluate either the efficiency or whether it all was as idyllic as they depicted. But this was a very small project, and it only started in the very last years of the imperial period.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Ken Pinnow who wants to know if you could say a little bit more about the categorization of children by doctors, and in particular, how did they define weakness when selecting them for the summer colonies?
Great question. And it's something I also wondered because, weakness is such a vague category, right? And there did not seem to be any specific kind of quantitative definition, but one could trace which problems were most widespread and which kind of contributed to this being labeled as a weak. Anemia was one problem, and apparently I can't give you the exact number right now, but I have it in my book. So it's somehow extremely high proportion of pupils was considered anemic. Then basically weight and the kind of height and weight for their age was a very important factor because of this nutrition and undernutrition issues. So these are the key factors. But otherwise, it seems that it was up to physicians, so they could decide themselves who is weak, and there were much more weaker children than the places in this summer colony. So they thought that a huge, like almost every fifth child in Moscow schools is a weak child.
Thank you. We have another question from Raymond Arendt, who wonders if in your research you came across any indication that in addition to the live slaughterhouses, that there was an effort to ship already chilled meat into Moscow as a part of sanitation efforts.
There was indeed this parallel process of shipping cooled and frozen meat, but it was very seasonal because these refrigerators, and this is something that was, the development of this type of technology, which is very important for the American meat markets, for instance. In the Imperial Russia, that technology was not yet widely available. And in fact, the construction of a big refrigerator in Moscow, like meaning refrigerator storage facility, was kind of something that was being actively discussed, but was not there most of the time. And so it was a winter thing. When, because of a specific weather condition and the frost, that it was possible to supply frozen meat. But winter period, especially the end of winter, is a Lent time. in the Orthodox Church, and when the consumption of meat is very low, and that is also mentioned often in the sources. So the in Russia, the consumption of meat was really not stable because it depended on this Orthodox regulation. So let's say for part of the season when you could possibly ship frozen meat, the demand was in fact very low. So this has to be also taken into account.
Thank you so much. Again, if you have questions, please send them to me in the chat and I'll read them for Anna to respond to. We do have another question from Raymond. In terms of the rural children and your research, did you come across any indication that the rural children might benefit from living very close to livestock and soil? This idea that they could build up their immunity by sort of being out in the natural environment that's often talked about today. Did you see any evidence of that in your sources?
Well, I'm very much familiar with this discourse you are referring to and kind of profess it in my own parenting strategies. But when we speak about the 19th century, the challenges were very different. And it's so there, just to be very clear, in the Moscow province, out of 1,000 children, 534 children did not live until the age of 5. So this is more than 50% of children didn't survive there until the age of 5, and I think about maybe 29 of 30 children didn't survive until the age of 1. So this is not about building your immunity, and developing your microbiome. It's a real life and death challenge of you against the bacteria and viruses that are there. So this, and the most important cause of death among children in Russia was the diarrheal diseases, which was connected to the problems with feeding. So there are many it's also a number of scholars have done research on that. But it's just to recap, it's connected to the very early introduction of solid food, the inability of mothers to breastfeed for a sufficiently long time because they had to go back to work, both in the countryside and in the city. And this is what explains these dramatic differences in infant mortality among the Orthodox and the Muslim or Jewish population, where women, kind of the cultural norms encouraged women to stay with their children for longer and didn't pressure women to go back to work so early. So this is also the contemporary. There is both. It's both in the sources and there is some historical research on that. So because of this, unavailability of breast milk, the kind of the pumped milk that went sour, the early introduction of solids, the bacterial contamination of foods was probably very high, and this led to this various gastroenteric problems of children. So I think we are in that period, we're in a very different type of human bacterial interaction, I would say, than when we are now, before vaccination, except for smallpox vaccination. And we don't have access, most people do not have access to safe water. They don't have access to a fridge where they could safely store milk. They do not always have access to kitchens to boil milk, for instance, or boil food or boil water. So there, it kind of, you touch here upon a very important aspect here of with multi-species studies. So there, it's not only about this multi-species sociality and mutual benefit, but it's also about a competition and this kind of instances when proximity could be deadly.
Thank you for such a rich answer. We have kind of a connected question from Palina Podmitina. She would like to know more broadly about immunity in the sense that was this idea of immunity discussed in your documents, in the interviews and things that you read? It of maybe was yet to be formally discovered, but was there a concept of it? Was it imagined? Was it ever discussed?
It was a concept that's kind of being formulated at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, all these debates on healthy carrier. So internationally, it's a part of a medical science. But I can't say that it somehow is important to the public health work in my sources. So the idea to build any kind of collective immunity or to reinforce specifically immunity is not very much there. I think there is a kind of a general understanding of creating good conditions, and that if you eat well, if you rest, all these recommendations that even today physicians give you if they don't have a treatment for your disease, for example, if it's a virus for which there is no antiviral therapy available. So rest, eat, sleep, these kind of things were already there, but kind of a terminology of immunity was not important in the 19th century Moscow municipal public health.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how alcohol usage may have figured into conversations about sanitization, if they did? Was alcoholism thought to be a problem for building a sanitary city, or was that thought to be a separate problem?
Interestingly, it's not a very important topic there. It appears once in a while, and sometimes in really bizarre aspects, like, for instance, claiming that alcohol use contributes to the spread of some infectious disease, like cholera, which is not correct. Usually it's waterborne. So if anything, drinking alcohol and not water might have helped. So this kind of, is a um, exacerbating factor sometimes mentioned. It's also not occasionally mentioned in the discussion of child infant health. So, this kind of alcohol consumption by mothers is bad. But again, it's not very high, much lower than, in my feeling was that it was much lower than kind of more general social conditions and overcrowding and poverty and so on. So yes, there is an acknowledgement of this problem, but I wouldn't say it was particularly high in the municipal discussions.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Fran, do we have time for another question or do I need to? Okay, all right. Excellent. So this might be our last question. Anna, can you talk a little bit about how public health and sanitization efforts were related to residency in the sense that were there efforts to restrict citizens' neighborhoods or where they could live based on an understanding of disease or spreading disease, or certain people needed to live in certain neighborhoods in order to serve public health?
Oh, very good question. Thank you for this too. So very kind of two important aspects here. So one is residency and access to healthcare. So there is a restriction here that kind of this Moscow municipal public health is not available to everyone, but you are supposed to pay a hospital tax, which is very small. But well, at least it's a once a year you pay, I think, about 1 ruble and 25 kopecks. So well, not it's noticeable. So the salary is maybe about 20 rubles, but you pay it not every month, but once a year. And kind of theoretically, the access to hospitals and the outpatient clinics was available to those who have paid this hospital tax. So there is certain residency requirement to have access to these hospitals. However, I couldn't find any material what happens if a person is sick and then comes to a hospital and has not paid this tax. So I have a suspicion that they were accepted maybe anyway, especially in the times of epidemics. So at least that did not seem to be a kind of a major preoccupation, this non-payment of the hospital tax, but it existed. But as for this segregation type of policies, I think this is very important. That I also did research in Moscow social topography, and Moscow was generally not a very segregated city. In fact, the urban poor, they lived everywhere. So wherever the type of the neighborhood they differed depending on whether the wealthy lived there, but the poor were present in all of Moscow neighborhoods for various reasons, because there's like poor public transport and so on. And so there was no kind of specific restriction that the poor or the sick should be relocated to a specific neighborhood. It did happen kind of by itself to some extent when the sewerage system was launched, when the certain areas in the city became more expensive, and it kind of pushed some poorer people outside, and it was easier to find housing in the outskirts. And so there was kind of the expansion in the late imperial decades was happening primarily through the outskirts, and there were fewer healthcare services and sanitary services there. But I do not have any information and have not encountered anything like that in the sources, that there was a discussion that no, they are sick and they are poor and they should live here and not there. No.
Thank you so much, Anna. Well, I encourage everyone to check out your book, Sanitizing Moscow, Waste, Animals, and Urban Health in Late Imperial Russia, just out from University of Pittsburgh Press. Thank you again so much for such a rich and fascinating talk. Really, really enjoyed it. The last two announcements I'd like to make. We've got two more talks in the series this semester on March 30th. We have Tom Dolak of Wheaton College, who will speak about his edited collection on Russian literature and cognitive science. And then on April 20th, we'll have Kate Trenchell, who will speak about the new slavery, accounts of human trafficking in Eastern Europe, also at noon to 1:30. So if you are subscribed to the Jordan Center emails, you'll get a notification. If not, you can go to the Jordan Center website and sign up to join our Zooms on those days. Again, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Anna. And stay safe out there. Take care of yourselves, take care of your communities.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm so glad to have at least virtually met some people who I only know through their scholarship. So I very much appreciate your engagement.
Thank you so much, Anna. Take care.
Mm.